Well, good afternoon, everyone. Again, still working our way through some new technical issues. Rob Gilligan, where are you when you need us if you're watching this? But we're going to do the best we can. A little bit different program this afternoon. We're recording this Monday afternoon at about 3 o'clock. What we want to do is kind of review where the Kansas Legislature is after they finished what we call turnaround deadline. Where all the bills are, things that are going on, look a little bit ahead. I am Mark Tallman with KASB.
I'm Leah Fliger.
And I am Scott Rothschild.
So what we're going to do is give you a quick, just real quickly, where we are in the session, walk through our major issues and some of the other things that we've been following closely. Last Thursday was what we call turnaround. People wonder, well, what does that mean? Well, it's because that is in theory the deadline for bills to have passed the House they were introduced in. So all House bills should be passed by the House. They turn around. You remember that how a bill becomes law thing that you studied, and are considered by the Senate on their way to passing or not passing. The reality is, though, there are always a lot of bills that are exempt, sometimes called blessed, that are not bound by those. So we'll mention what some of those are. And of course, everyone always says, you know, they never do anything till the end. Well, partly that's the way it was designed. You go through this bicameral process. Key thing is legislature will come back this Wednesday. Then March 20th is the deadline for committees to work bills again. And then we will have about 2 weeks where there will be final floor action and then some time left over for conference committees as we make our way till the end of the regular session scheduled April 3rd. Of course, more and more now, big issues tend to be left to the non-regular session, the veto session, which is scheduled to begin Monday, April 27th. That usually lasts 1 or 2 weeks. Depends on how many big issues are unresolved. We'll see about that. Before we kind of dig into our specific legislation issues, guys, any kind of general observations about the session so far?
No, go ahead.
I think because Gannon is not the forefront issue, although there are some issues connected to Gannon, it is different for us in that we are not kind of the ones, you know, some people say, you guys aren't in the spotlight this year, you know, and so that's been somewhat refreshing, I think, for a lot of people in education advocacy.
And I guess at the halftime mark, there's a real struggle going on over Medicaid and abortion, you know, issues that we aren't really paying that close attention to, but it could affect the way other bills are treated during the session.
Whenever you have sort of must-pass issues, like the budget, for example, when people are absolutely digging in and trying to find that last vote to pass a constitutional amendment or to pass a major policy like Medicaid expansion would be, things tend to get tied together. So we'll certainly be watching for that. Well, what we'd like to do is kind of go through the issues sort of by several topics. We're going to look at what we have called pathways in the priority resolution that our members adopted at our delegate assembly. So there's about 5 big areas that we group issues under. And the first one is to attract and retain qualified, effective educators and support staff. I think we've said that obviously an important part of the staff you have is how many people can you afford and what do you pay them? And as long as for about 8 years, Kansas education funding was falling behind inflation, 2 things happened. Positions were cut and salaries didn't go up very much. With the phase in of the Gannon settlement for the past several years, districts have added people back and they've been able to have salary increases higher than the rate of inflation. We are expecting that to continue. The governor recommended continuing to fund the Gannon settlement on base state aid per pupil. The Senate Ways and Means Committee has adopted that recommendation. The House Appropriations Committee will consider that. That's what's being recommended by the K-12 Budget Committee. Wednesday morning, we'll look at that, and eventually those recommendations will be sort of rolled into the 2 main appropriations bills. There's a supplemental appropriation bill, a main appropriation bill, sometimes called the mega bill. Oh, and just to confuse things, at the end of the session, there's supposed to be the omnibus bill, which wraps there. So if you hear us talk about omnibus, that's what that means. But at this point, no one is deviating, no one is suggesting not following the dollar amounts in the Gannon settlement. I'll make one other comment and then talk about a few other things in this area. The governor, again, Governor Kelly proposed re-amortizing the CAPER's long-term debt, which is simplest way to think about it is you kind of take out a new mortgage. Her argument is you could have a lower annual cost, but legislators point out, but we would pay more in the long term. So you want to pay a little bit now to give some budget relief, more in the long term. Last year, the legislature rejected that. Last week, the House took that provision out of the bill, but they left in another part of the governor's recommendation, which is to take about $285 million, because our balances are very healthy right now, pay off some missed payments over the last several years. That too, just doing that will save about $25 million a year in payment, and also save some interest that the state general fund would have to pay for over that. So that's kind of where we are. Scott, anything you want to add to that? Or
well, it's interesting that, like you said, this is the second year that this has been, the governor has proposed and the legislature has disposed of it. And it's kind of interesting that in the comments from legislators, they don't think it's a bad idea.
Right.
They keep saying, well, the timing's a little bit off. Well, that's kind of an interesting argument, because eventually you're going to have to pay this, and the payments increase dramatically in the next several years to almost like $1 billion. And in our budget, $1 billion is real money. And so something is going to have to be done at some point. Some legislators say they would prefer to defer, yes, to the CAPER's board to make that recommendation. But it's a fascinating fiscal problem that we have, and it has to be addressed at some point.
And the CAPER's board has, for the last 2 years, come out against doing this, but they've already directed their staff internally to begin
start figuring it out.
To do what some people call layering, which is just essentially a way of, well, I'm not even going to try to explain it, only to say that a lot of what this is about is, as Scott said, we're going to reach a point of paying about $1 billion a year, but then in like 2034, suddenly it's all paid off. And so everyone says, that's the year you want to be in the legislature. But a lot of people have said, it really doesn't make sense to have that big a drop. So what people are talking about is somehow kind of smoothing that out. So instead of re-amortizing, but still having the mortgage is all paid off in 25 years, to more gradually come into a period of time where you kind of have rolling payments. It is interesting, but I don't know how interesting, because frankly, none of this is expected to have any impact on benefits or anything else. That's the key thing. Also in the area of kind of salaries, benefits, when we look at qualified staff, there is kind of the question of professional development. And there has been a little discussion around that. Might just note that 2 years ago, I think it was, the legislature put together a task force to look at dyslexia. One of their recommendations is to have a position in KSDE to be sort of a dyslexia coordinator. The governor did not recommend that. The Senate committee did recommend adding a little less than $100,000 for that position. The House has said we'll look at that at the end when we do the omnibus position. So that issue is still kind of out there. Any thoughts on that? You guys have followed the dyslexia task force about as much as I have. So
well, the state board, I think late last year, approved a lot of recommendations aimed at identifying kids earlier and getting teachers more training and more support in this area, because it has been a problem for years as far as getting kids more quickly identified. So the state board has kind of been on top of it, and I think, to be honest, I think they're planning to have this position going. And of course, they need the funding, but I'm sure there's funding there somewhere for that.
Does seem to be a high priority, but it's one of those things that legislature continues to ask KSDE to do more and more. But whenever who should we do that? Well, prioritize and make room. So we'll see how that plays out. One last thing, I guess, under quality of educators, we should note a big push this year by a couple groups, some legislators, Chamber of Commerce. I mean, there's a group of people who were really pushing expediting professional licensing. And last week, both the House and Senate have passed bills. I think they ended up being 2 pretty much identical bills were introduced on each side. And then there was a lot of discussion, and the sponsors of those bills, and Representative Chris Croft of Johnson County has really kind of led in this area. And so a whole set of amendments were brought in. It really comes down to this. The desire is to say that if you are transferred here as part of the military, or if you show you want to come to Kansas to work, all of these licensing boards, including the State Board of Education for teachers, but engineers, architects, all manner of law enforcement, a number of different individuals are all licensed or regulated or registered by the state. And this law basically says if someone is licensed in another state, it kind of makes the presumption that they should be quickly licensed in Kansas. Now, the language is substantially equivalent training. We kind of took the position because we hear two things. We hear some of our members saying we struggle getting qualified teachers. It's a real problem. We also are concerned about standards and what's the role of the state board. Well, the state board was neutral on this position. They basically, their only concern was some timing issues for background checks. That was apparently resolved. So both the House and Senate have pretty overwhelmingly passed this bill. And if there are any differences, they'll be resolved in conference committee. But it looks like this is probably going to go to the governor. We'll then see how the governor, because there is some concern of this from some of the professional organizations about this. So I don't know if the governor's weighed in on where she would be, but it does seem to be moving forward. The next area we want to talk about is give all students the opportunity to succeed. A couple areas under that. One is early childhood. I'll just say real simply, the governor has recommended essentially continuing early childhood programs as is. Both the House and Senate have adopted that. The second topic under kind of student opportunity has been a bigger one, and that is at-risk funding for two reasons. One, the high-density at-risk program, about $50 million, which goes to districts with the highest concentration of low-income kids, and by all accounts, those with the greatest need. $50 million will expire or sunset at the end of this year, won't be around next year unless the legislature extends it. So that's going to have to happen anyway. But the legislature a few years ago laid out a schedule of audits by the post-audit committee, and this was the year it was at-risk's turn, and I think somewhat to people's surprise, post-audit kind of came in and well, they talking about the state board, they didn't think they were following the law. And by implication, a lot of school districts weren't following the law, even though basically they were doing what the state board let them do what they were doing. So this has produced a lot of angst around this within the legislature. Here's what happened last week. The Senate passed a bill which simply extends that sunset for 2 more years. So it doesn't permanently take it away, stay in place for 2 years. That would presumably allow study whatever possible changes. House passed a bill a lot more detailed. It extends the provision for 5 years, but then it also has some greater specificity on how funds have to be used. You have to put your weighting in the at-risk fund, which I assume pretty much people do anyway. You have to choose at-risk programs from a predetermined list of evidence-based programs supported by the state board, rather than now the state board, just as part of your consolidated plan that you do for federal and other programs, gives approval, and there's no master list. Now there will be, except districts can do what is called a provisional program, saying we've got a promising program, it's not on the list, we'd like to try it for a year, and then the state board can look at it and see whether or not they want to add that. There's some more reporting requirements of essentially having to show what impact your programs, not individually but collectively, are having on at-risk students. In effect, are these programs being effective? And then finally, another official post-audit is required in 2023. So those have both passed. That means each house will take a look at the other's bill. Likely it will end up in a conference committee and kind of come in somewhere around those parameters. Leah, I want you to talk about the issue of some of both the reading issues and a few things like that. I think we come to, anyone else have any thoughts on at-risk before we leave that? Because that's really ended up being probably the main education issue of the session.
I think it's just a great opportunity for you, in the next several weeks as legislators have coffees or are back in the district, or you just happen to see them. You need to be able to explain what you do with your at-risk funding.
Yeah, I mean, I think the main problem with this issue is just that there's been a lack of understanding between sort of the education establishment or community and legislators. And the more you can explain things, the better off we will be.
Right. Well, the House also passed another bill kind of tied around reading issues, at-risk student issues. Leah, you were following that. I shouldn't say that. The House committee passed that to general order.
Right.
Tell us about the reading.
It is the.
Sorry, Representative Erickson, we're forgetting.
Reading readiness.
Reading readiness.
Readiness
program.
The
Reading readiness.
Yes, and that was passed by the House K-12 Education Budget Committee. It's a bill that would allow students who are scoring below grade level on their reading assessments in grades 3 or 4 to take an amount of money, basically a voucher, based on their base state aid, and they could take that money, really functioning as a voucher, and use that to attend an accredited private school in Kansas. Or if you wanted to stay in your public school, you could take an amount that's generated by the at-risk weighting, so 0.484 times your base state aid. State treasurer would set up an account for the student and parents, and they could use that account to pay for evidence-based programs that somehow the parents believe will address the students' reading issues. That could be used throughout their career, as you might call it. So even up until their high school years.
Yeah. You have to apply for the program if you are below grade level in 3rd or 4th grade.
That's right.
But once you qualify for the program, you're always eligible, even if you are doing okay in future assessments.
That's right.
It would continue.
So the bill was blessed, as we call it, at the end of the turnaround session there, to enable it to remain alive and remain eligible for consideration. So it's been, it was passed out of committee, but the full House did not vote on it last week. It's now sitting in the House Appropriations Committee, which means that it is like creatures in a horror movie, still alive. So.
and just for several of these, we may mention, if they are in the House Appropriations Committee, they could either rest there, might be worked, might not, or they could be referred back to general orders.
Right.
Or they could even be referred back to the K-12 Budget Committee. That's all controlled by the Speaker.
That's right.
But eventually it will have to pass the full House to get anywhere. I suspect this will be pretty controversial, but again, it comes back to legislative concern about, how effective are our schools, what do we need to do to make that happen? And in this case, it is again, I'll channel what I think the sponsors would say. Well, this is only goes to kids who are not at grade level. The school district has not been able to get them where they need to be, so let's give them another option to try to get there. That's the argument behind it.
There was another bill on educational outcomes that was passed by the Senate, and it's Senate Bill 384, I think is the number. Senator Baumgardner. It requires the KASB and DCF to begin preparing an annual report on educational outcomes of students in foster care. It was prompted by some excellent reporting late in 2019 by Kansas City Star reporters about the challenges that students face in foster care and how that impacts their education. So that bill was passed by the Senate and should be heading to the House for further action.
Yeah, and that bill got pretty widespread or support. And we've had reports for years of, really a foster care system that is in a crisis situation, not only in Kansas, but across the nation. And there are studies showing that, these kids who are moved and shuffled around sometimes dozens of times in their childhood actually suffer traumatic stress and brain disorders. And so I think
and very, very low graduation rates, and some of the discussion has been because that movement makes it very difficult to complete and acquire the appropriate number of credits. Add that to the fact that districts may have higher requirements than required by state law, and although state law says those students should be able to graduate with the minimum number,
if you can't get the records together and you
Yeah,
can't verify the
exactly.
credit.
So once again, this is one of those things that while the onus of this bill is initially on the State Board of Education, Department of Children and Families to report this information, it ultimately becomes information that school districts are going to have to use to do something about, or will continue to be criticized by saying, well, we're compiling this, what are we going to do about it? And it is clearly a very complex problem, but it's also one, if we're going to move up overall educational outcomes, solving this very difficult issue is going to have to be part of our conversation at the local level as well. So, okay, let's move on to yet another area under kind of the give all students the opportunity to succeed, and that's the area of special education. As many of you may know, in November, the experts got together and determined or estimated that enrollment, both actual kids and weighted students, is not going to grow as much as expected. That means that there will be fewer kids to multiply by base state aid per pupil, which means the program isn't going to cost as much as the money that have already been appropriated. Okay, so the State Board of Education has said that I need to adjust something on my computer. So let's see if I can talk at the same time. The State Board of Education said, hey, let's take that funding, which is about $40 million a year, and oh my gosh.
There you go.
There we go. Sorry again, our continuing technical issues. Let's take that money and put it into special education because that is funded far below the 92% target. So the governor did not recommend that, and so pretty compelling evidence was presented in both budget committees on the House and Senate side. However, both essentially said, we don't know if we can do that, but we don't want to say no. And so both of them are recommending that when the legislature comes back for the final veto session in late April, after new revenue numbers and everything are out, they will consider whether they want to put that money in. So the issue isn't over. Those of you who have been advocating for it continue to do so, but understand that, if you're going to take that money that the governor didn't spend in a given place, then you're going to have to figure out, well, where does that come from? Are we cutting further into any balances? Are we taking from another program? Are we not doing some other priority? What does it mean for tax cuts, et cetera? So there are a lot of ideas on what to do with that $40 million, but no one has said no yet.
Right.
So that issue will likely kind of continue. Also in the area of special education, just probably a technical issue, the House passed a bill that would change in state law reference from emotionally disturbed children, students, whatever, to emotionally disabled, and an even maybe more obscure bill that you wonder, well, why has this happened before? The Senate passed a bill that would allow schools as well as post-secondary institutions and foster care homes to get a temporary placard for students with disabilities that you try. Well, why is that needed? Well, apparently now it has to be tied to a particular vehicle, and of course, so decades after the passage of special education law, somebody realized, and actually I think it was Senator Gibbons, Bruce Gibbons, the special ed director himself, brought this forward, and it has moved ahead. And one last thing would note, the House has passed a bill to establish a state grant program to try to expand broadband service to underserved areas. At this point, it is simply setting up the mechanism, not necessarily the money, but at least that is a step forward. Our next pathway is student health and safety. And Leah, why don't you lead off with kind of the mental health issue?
Well, Governor Kelly has proposed several changes in her budget to the two-year-old pilot program that many of you are probably familiar with for school-based mental health services. We know that's taking place in several districts. The changes in her budget bill would increase funding by about $5 million, would make the program a competitive grant rather than the pilot that it is now. And it would also allow participation by providers other than the community health centers. Right now it's restricted to the CMHCs, but this change projected in the governor's budget would allow districts to enter into agreements with other mental health care providers, such as a hospital or other private providers in your area. So the Senate Ways and Means Committee has agreed to to that recommendation, but the House, again, appropriators and budgeteers will start talking about that this week. Now, the House K-12 Education Budget Committee is considering an alternative bill sponsored by Representative Brenda Landwehr that would convert that pilot program into a weighting that would be in the school funding formula. It would lower I think now the state is paying all of the costs for the mental health interventionist that the school district.
I think the state's paid 75%.
75%. Well, anyway, it would go from 75. It would go to 75%.
Okay.
In the bill, and the problem that some of the legislators on the committee have expressed concerns about is if we make this part of the school funding formula, the school funding law, and the legislature cannot provide the funding in the future for that, it becomes part of a school funding lawsuit. So members of that House K-12 Education Budget Committee met last week, hashed out some issues. They seem to have kind of come to a consensus that however we fund that program, it will not be in the formula. It will be a separate part of statute, and that they will talk about over this legislative break here that they have until Wednesday. They're going to go back and talk to their school districts about whether it should be strictly with the CMHCs, whether they should also be able to contract with private providers. And they seem to reach some recommendation on the 75-25 split between the state and the school district. So that is where that bill is, or that item is as we head into the second half of the session.
Right now.
I think everybody agrees that it's a great program.
Right.
The question is, how do you fund it, and how do you fund it sustainably so that it can continue and expand?
And while it is limited to a fairly small number of districts, it includes some of our larger districts.
Right.
But I think one of the questions is, part of the idea behind a weighting is, well, that might mean everyone could get involved,
Right.
which is part of what the legislature is concerned.
Yeah.
But the other thing that would hold it back is just the limited number of staff to do this.
Right.
In other words, to expand this, you basically are hiring
Right.
new experts, and
They're kind of in short supply.
Right.
that's right. And so part of the idea is this will be controlled by just availability
Yeah,
of
the labor
staff to
supply.
do it.
Yeah.
But but Leah's point is, if you have thoughts or concerns, if
Mhm.
you're currently in the program, if you want to get in the program, really important now to be talking to your House member. You may not have one on that committee. If you do, that would be great. But your House member can certainly communicate their concerns
With
to
their
that committee,
colleagues.
and will ultimately be voting for it either in that committee, the Appropriations Committee, or on the floor in
Mhm.
some fashion. So need to be aware of that. That is a health issue which has taken a lot of concern under mental health. Another thing that we know has drawn a lot of concern has been the vaping issue.
Yes.
Where are we there with that,
Yes.
Leah?
Well, we had one bill that just banned e-cigarettes, vape pens from schools and other indoor public places under the Indoor Clean Air Act. That went nowhere and was stricken from the House calendar last week. There's a second bill that's pending that not only incorporates vaping under the Indoor Clean Air Act, so it would allow you as a school board to ban vaping in your buildings.
With the force of law, not
Yes.
just by policy.
Right. It also raises the age to purchase tobacco and e-cigarettes to 21 to comply with federal law. So that is still on House General Orders, and it's exempt from that turnaround deadline that we've referenced. So you can expect to see at least discussion about that bill. I would be surprised if there wasn't some kind of vote on it at some point.
Yeah. And then I guess a couple of other bills that don't appear to be going anywhere.
Yes, there was a bill dealing with parental consent for certain surveys and tests. I think you're probably familiar with those general issues that had a courtesy hearing but did not pass out. There was another bill that would authorize schools to maintain emergency medications such as albuterol or EpiPens. There was another bill that would have required legislative approval for childhood vaccinations for childcare or school-age students. That did not pass out. And there was another bill to allow placement of cameras on school buses to help catch people who are passing school buses on the right and or the left side as kids are getting on and off. Very dangerous. And then the Senate.
But not dangerous enough for the bill to come out of committee.
Apparently not.
Apparently
Yeah,
yet.
I think there were a
not,
lot
not
of.
to make light, there are
Right.
a lot of, how do we know who's driving? How do we know
Right.
who's, so
Right.
not a simple
What if,
issue.
What if you're the car owner, but someone else is driving your car and committing the violation? So yeah, the data seems to show that there could be 1,000 violations a day of people blowing past school buses. And I think a lot of your transportation directors out there will say, yeah, they believe that's a problem. So I think it's something that may see some action next year. I think they're getting closer. Law enforcement was on board with this bill this year, and they have not been in the past. So perhaps next year they'll make some more progress on it. The Senate Education Committee tabled a bill that would have required school districts to report incidents of bullying. We already do, but this would have established some additional requirements on that. And the mechanisms in the bill had not been recommended by the state Blue Ribbon Task Force on Bullying. That continues to, those recommendations continue to be vetted by the School Mental Health Advisory Committee, which is chaired by State Education Chairman Kathy Bush. And so we expect to see some more activity on those recommendations, but that bill was tabled in the Senate Education Committee.
The next pathway we'll talk briefly about is prepare students for post-secondary and career success. One bill that KASB was supporting is a Senate bill that would allow districts to use their funds to pay all or a portion of the student tuition costs for concurrent or dual enrollment. We've had a statute dealing with this ability for kids to get credit both at the high school and post-secondary at the same time for many decades. It has become much more popular, and of course for career technical programs under what it used to be called Senate Bill 155, and now I think is called the Excel and CTE program. It kind of has a fancier name. That's free anyway, but there's still, if you're just taking, college algebra, public, whatever it may be, the student has to come up with the cost of that tuition, and that can be a real barrier for some of our low-income students. So this is a bill really led by, but supported by others, Wichita, who has a program they're wanting to expand for their student population. The Senate put in a lot of tweaks to that on reporting and everything, but essentially it has passed. There have been no hearings in the Senate yet. The House, in the House. The House has passed a bill that would start a new scholarship program geared at students taking technical courses or up to associate's degree. So it would be limited to that track of students, partly reflecting, I think, a concern over lack of jobs in those areas, that we're actually doing a better job producing kind of bachelor's degree kids in Kansas and not necessarily kids with technical skills or those 2-year degrees. That has passed the House, and I think with the target funding of about $20 million. So for those of you, as we know, part of our Kansans Can goal and responsibility of school districts is to help kids get into post-secondary education. That could be a real benefit. The Senate had a somewhat similar bill that came out of the Education Committee, has not passed the Senate, but I think it's expected that those two are going to come together, and there will be some new student aid available, as a way of dealing with that cost issue. One end is trying to hold tuition down, another is to try to target financial aid, and this is the approach that is taking. The House also passed a bill that is designed to create some liability protections for employers in work-based learning. It would require school districts to cover kids in these circumstances under their activities insurance for student activities. You're not required to do these programs, but I think what it basically says, if you're going to do them, you have to have coverage for students just as you would in other programs. Excuse me. And then kind of the final area we'll talk a little bit about is effective school operations. One of the big issues that, again, kind of came out of nowhere a little bit, I guess, not really on everyone's radar screen early on, is bond and interest state aid, or more technically called capital improvement state aid. And what has really become clear over time is that since the legislature went to a different formula for calculating how much aid you will get, what percent of your bond the state may pay for was changed in 2015, and it was pegged to the district with the lowest valuation in the state. Not named, just whatever that district was would get 75% of their bond paid for. Every $1,000 in assessed valuation per pupil, as you rose above that, you would drop 1%. So turns out that probably now and forever, the lowest valuation district is Fort Leavenworth, which is kind of unique in that, well, it's on a fort and it has no valuation essentially, and it cannot do a bond issue under state law. So what two bills introduced on both sides, both initially would do, would be just take Fort Leavenworth out of the calculation. That meant whatever the next lowest, and this tends to be around assessed valuation in the lower $20,000 per pupil, would now get 75% instead of currently getting about 50% and declining. The big concern is that over time, because most districts' valuation per pupil increases, just because valuation tends to increase, but Fort Leavenworth doesn't, it meant every year, it's kind of like in your income taxes, a bracket creep kind of thing. Every year, more and more districts lost eligibility, and those that were eligibility had less and less paid for, and that means that the reliance on property taxes, which produces wealth-based disparities, we're growing, raising constitutional issues unless something is done. The Senate has passed a bill that would address that problem, remove Fort Leavenworth, do two other things. It would go back and apply this to all bond issues passed since 2015, which many of you who've had a bond issue in the last 5 years would benefit, whereas the original concept was it would only affect bond issues going forward. It would also, however, remove virtual students from the assessed valuation for pupil calculation under the theory that, well, if you've got a big virtual enrollment, but those kids aren't there, then you don't need the support to build buildings. That's the theory behind it. And that means if you've got a big virtual enrollment problem, you would, not problem, if you had a big virtual enrollment, your problem might be that you would not get as much benefit from this program. But it's still a big enough change in aid that most districts would probably come out ahead, not all. We don't have a final estimate of what this will be, but the rough talk is somewhere between 16 and $20 million more for the state. So if you're talking about that $40 million in special ed savings, it could be another place where that might go if this went forward. This passed the Senate with very little debate, very little dissent, a bill from the House that only was prospective and did not make the change for virtual students, came out of the K-12 Budget Committee, but did not make it through the floor.
It was stricken
on the calendar basically means dead. That doesn't mean it can't be resurrected as an amendment or something. The bill is gone, and so that means the House will have to decide if they will look at the Senate bill, if they will have a new set of hearings, which would be kind of the normal course of things, and then probably ultimately it would be conference committee before that would get resolved. Long way of saying that there could be some pretty significant changes in state aid. I'll mention one other bill, and then there's a few other things we'll try to touch on. That is the fact, and the short news is we're no longer in this bill. We're only mentioning it because, of course, it could come up again. And that is a bill that would add some new notice requirements for cities, counties, and other local units other than school districts, but it would replace the tax lid that several years ago was imposed on everybody other than school districts. So our friends in local government are really trying to weigh, there would be some additional costs and mechanical problems to doing this notice, but it would take them out of this kind of hard tax lid that they've been under.
And it's very unpopular.
Right, tax lid variance. So I think that probably our friends in local government will probably end up saying, net, this may be a better deal. Our argument was because school districts are already either capped by maximum LOB or capped at 8 mils capital outlay, or you have to have an election to do a bond issue, and then you have to pay the bonds. That we were enough controlled that we didn't need to be under this. It would simply add an expensive new notice requirement. That was apparently accepted because we were not included in the bill as it passed the Senate. So Leah, there's a couple other things, or
Yeah.
Scott either. One may be what's happening on local unit contingency fees.
So the House Judiciary Committee started to hear a bill requested by the Kansas Attorney General that would limit the ability of local governments like a school district to enter into contingency fee lawsuits. Some of our school districts have used that mechanism to sue, like Juul, the vaping company. Others have, I think, in the past have used it to sue opioid manufacturers, and the bill would not affect those agreements that are already existing. However, moving forward, it would say that the Attorney General will be the one to enter into those agreements, not the school districts. Kind of an argument of having a single kind of coordinating point for those types of lawsuits. The bill had a hearing, was somewhat contentious because there was a somewhat lengthy substitute bill offered by Representative Brad Ralph, who was really trying to get everybody to come to some sort of compromise, and we all know that compromise means no one's happy. And there were a lot of questions about the bill, and that remains to be seen what's going to happen with that bill.
I think it's fair to say that the compromise proposal, which was drafted with a lot of stakeholder input, including KASB, had a voice at that table. Though no one signed off on anything, but it did make some changes so that it was not basically asking permission from the Attorney General. It was more, you have to give notice. And under circumstances, the AG could step in and intervene if he felt it was not in the interest of the state as a whole. So it is he or she. Thank you. It is a less dramatic less prescriptive than introduced, but certainly still would somewhat erode local flexibility. So we're watching that very carefully. Would certainly welcome people's feedback on that. So those are kind of the big things that we are looking at this point. Guys, am I missing any other things we want to talk about before my throat gives out?
No, I think we just have a few things we want to address here at the end. Back to the issue of funding and private education. In addition to the reading readiness bill that we've already discussed, there was another bill passed out of House K-12 education budget that would change the current program that awards income tax credits for contributions that are used for private school scholarships. The bill expands the eligibility for those scholarships from students who are on free lunch to those qualifying for free or reduced price meals, and it allows students currently attending or first-time students eligible to attend any public school in Kansas. So it exponentially expands the universe of kids who could apply for those vouchers. It does not change the $10 million annual cap on those vouchers, but it does expand the number of kids who would be eligible. So again, it was passed out of the committee, sent to the House floor where it was not acted upon, but it was also late last week sent to the House Appropriations Committee, so it remains alive for the foreseeable future. The Senate passed a bill that would allow students who are in accredited private schools to take the ACT, the work keys, and the pre-ACT test at no charge, as is currently happening in the public schools. And under the state's contract with ACT, there's no additional cost to the state, and so that passed pretty easily in the Senate. Kind of figured if a lot of kids are already, if there's no additional cost, sure, we'll say yes, that's no problem. And then the House Education Committee held a hearing a couple of weeks ago on a bill that would require Kansas public school students, well, actually public or private, to pass an American civics test in order to receive their high school diploma. We opposed that bill because, at least in public schools, students are already required to take American government classes, including the U.S. Constitution class, and it also conflicts with the state board's constitutional authority over curriculum and standards. So the bill, however, is a big favorite of the committee chairman, Representative Steve Hubert, and he was able to get that bill blessed, as we call it, and it was also sent to the House Appropriations Committee, where it continues to draw breath.
One last issue we'll mention very quickly is kind of the issue of tax policy, which in recent sessions has always been a huge issue. Has really been fairly quiet. I think somewhat I think there is some belief that the state does have the money to do something, but what the governor has proposed, restarting some local revenue sharing to try to reduce property taxes. Of course, there's a group of legislators that continues to want to decouple the state so you can itemize on your state income tax, because it's much harder at the federal government now because of that tax cut area. There's continuing discussion about sales tax on food or increasing the food sales tax rebate. The governor has proposed taxing electronic publications, art, things like you don't pay sales tax on an ebook, but you pay sales tax on a hardcover book. So proposal is, well, we should level that playing field. So right now there continues to be a number of ideas floating around. I think it's fair to say that none have really coalesced, but I would expect going into an election year, there probably is going to be some final push at the end to try to deliver some tax relief in some way. And then anything else?
Well, one major event that is coming up, and it comes up once every 10 years.
Oh, yeah.
Is the 2020 census. In about the middle of this month, households will be getting notices about how to fill out your census information, and the federal government will be providing that information. April 1st will be Census Day. I don't know why they picked April Fool's Day, but they had 10 years to think about it. Obviously it is important to make sure that as school leaders out there, to encourage that every Kansan is counted. A lot of our programs are dependent on an accurate count. So we want to make sure everyone is counted. You can have events at your schools. You can talk to your students, talk to your parents about that. And, it's just it's a very important issue, and it's pretty simple to accomplish.
And they say it takes 10 minutes, right? 10 minutes and 10 years of impact.
That's right.
The big issue, I think, is from some groups that fear giving this information.
Right.
And I think, if as a school, as educators, as teachers, you're seen as a trusted group and help encourage undercounted groups to participate, that's really critical to our whole state and every community, and certainly to those groups in terms of funding, political representation, and everything else.
This is the first time that the census is going to be completed primarily online. That's the big push. And I think in a lot of areas of our state, internet access at home is an issue for a lot of our students. And so there's many groups that are encouraging folks to, maybe open your school libraries in the evenings or on the weekends to allow people to come in and access the internet at school in order to complete that very important form.
So, yeah, I think everyone can agree. I mean, it's not a Republican or Democratic thing. It's we got to make every Kansan count, get our fair share of money, make sure our political representation is correct.
Okay, well, before we wrap up, I think we have maybe one more request of you.
Oh, yeah, I have Scott. A plug.
Yeah.
We're 2.5 years into the Kansans Can effort to redesign our public schools, and we at KASB would like to amplify and make more public all the great things you are doing. So we're asking that you send us your stories, send us your photos, email them to me, srothschild@kasb.org, and we will get them on the website. We'll get them in our publications. But Kansas is doing great things, and we need to get this word out to the public.
It's all about now accountability. There is a lot of legislators that want to know, what are we doing with the money? How are we helping those kids that were behind the lawsuit? What is school redesign all about? And maybe that sounds negative, but the fact is, if they don't get those answers, they're going to continue to feel that way. So what we're trying to do at our level, and encourage you to do at the local level, is simply provide the information. What are we doing? What changes have you been able to make? What are you seeing? What results are you getting? Or what results are you trying to get, and what strategies you're using? So that's a critical part of it. Well, guys, thank you very much. Thank you all for viewing this. as I said, this is Monday, March 2nd. The legislature will be back Wednesday, the 4th. We will expect to have our regular Friday wrap up, probably of a pretty short week this Friday, and then continue throughout the rest of the session. So thank you very much. Always, if you have any questions, please let one of us know. Thank you.